There's a moment no one prepares you for, where you did everything right, and nothing moves. Not failure, not rejection, just silence. And the dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like something is wrong. It feels like you've been overlooked. And if you're in that moment right now, what you're about to understand might change how you see everything. Because this doesn't feel like things going wrong. It feels like being overlooked. You stayed consistent when quitting would have been easier. You chose integrity when shortcuts were available. You held your ground while everything around you bent. And still, nothing. That's the tension. Because if things were clearly failing, it would make sense. But this quiet silence after doing the right thing, creates a different question. Was it even worth it? Not loudly, but quietly, in the way your energy drops. You don't say it out loud, but it shows up. In the way your energy drops, in the way your expectations shrink, in the way hope starts to feel risky. That's where the shift begins. Because waiting without explanation doesn't just test your patience. It rewires how you see everything. You start looking around, and something feels off. People cutting corners move faster. People ignoring principles get results. And somehow, they advance. And suddenly, your certainty starts to crack. Not into doubt, into confusion. And this is where it starts to break. Because deep down, you believed something simple. What you do comes back to you. Faithfulness leads somewhere. Consistency builds something. Obedience aligns something. That belief was quiet, but it was strong. Until now. But because standing in this silence, it starts to feel fragile. And here's the part almost no one admits. It's not just about results. It's about recognition. Not from people, from something higher. You expected it to be seen, counted, acknowledged. But instead, it feels like you've been planting into nothing. And silence does something dangerous. It distorts. It makes you question timing. It makes you question direction. It makes you question yourself. That's the distortion. And once it starts, everything begins to look wrong. You replay decisions in your mind, trying to find what went wrong. And slowly, the question shifts. From, when will this work? To, did I get this wrong? That shift is where most people disconnect. Not by quitting, but by pulling back. Less expectation, less intensity, less belief. And over time, that quiet reduction changes everything. Because faithfulness without understanding turns into exhaustion. And exhaustion starts to look like indifference. But what if none of this means what you think it means? What if the real problem isn't that your faithfulness is being ignored, but that you've been measuring it the wrong way? Because there is a pattern. And the dangerous part is, you've already been inside it this whole time. You just didn't see it. The moment you start expecting a return, something shifts. Not outside, inside. Because without noticing, you place a timeline on something that was never meant to follow your clock. That's the error. It feels logical. You did the work. You stayed consistent. You made the right decisions. So something should come back. Soon. At least a sign. But when nothing comes, the silence starts to feel personal. Like something is off. And this is where most people get it wrong. And here's the mistake almost no one sees. You assumed faithfulness would produce immediate evidence. You assumed alignment would feel fast. You assumed progress would be visible. It isn't. Not always. Because not everything that is working looks like it's working. Some things only look like nothing. That's the misinterpretation. Yet you read delay as absence. You read silence as disapproval. You read stillness as stagnation. But none of that is real. It's conditioning. You were trained to expect movement, to look for signals, to validate progress through results. So when results don't show, your mind tries to fix it. It starts searching for errors, rechecking decisions, recalculating direction, until it lands on a conclusion. Maybe this isn't working. But that conclusion is built on a false measurement, because you're trying to evaluate something internal with external evidence. That mismatch creates pressure. Pressure to change what isn't wrong. Pressure to abandon what hasn't matured. Pressure to force movement, just to feel safe. That's where the break begins. Not because the path is wrong, but because the feedback is missing. And when feedback disappears, most people don't stay. They adjust too early. They shift too fast. They trade depth for speed. And it feels justified, because from the outside, nothing was happening anyway. But here's the part no one explains. Something was happening. You just weren't looking where it was forming. Because there is a phase where everything is being built without visibility. No signs, no confirmation, no evidence you can point to. And yet, it's the phase that determines everything. That's the part most people never survive. Not because it's hard to act, but because it's hard to continue without proof. And if you don't understand this phase, you will walk away from it every time, right before it starts to respond. This is where everything starts to reorganize, because what you're experiencing isn't random. It's structured. There is a law behind it, not a metaphor, not motivation, a law. And once you see it, you stop reacting emotionally and start understanding precisely. That's the shift. The biblical harvest law was never designed to reward impatience. It was designed to protect process. And the first illusion it breaks is simple. Planting and receiving are not the same moment. They never were. The structure is simple, but almost no one respects it. Planting is immediate. Growth is hidden. Harvest is delayed. 3 phases, 3 timelines. That's the structure. And most people collapse all 3 into one expectation. That's why frustration appears. Because you act today, and tomorrow you're already looking for movement. Yeah, you adjust your behavior. And within days, you expect signs. You stay consistent. And within weeks, you want proof. But the system doesn't respond that way. It never did. Because the moment the seed is planted, the process starts. Immediately. No delay in activation, only in manifestation. That's the distinction. And because you can't see activation, you assume nothing is happening. That's the mistake. So you question the seed. You question the timing. You question the path. Eventually, you question yourself. But the issue isn't any of that. It's expectation. Trying to pull forward something that requires time to become irreversible. Because growth needs conditions you can't accelerate. Time, pressure, resistance, transformation you cannot see. And all of it happens in a space where you have no control and no visibility. That's why this law is difficult to trust. Because it demands something unnatural. Continuity without confirmation. You keep showing up. You keep planting. You keep aligning without reinforcement. And that feels risky. Like investing energy into something that may not return. But here's the correction. The harvest is not a response to intensity. It's a response to continuity. Not bursts, not emotion, continuity. That's the rule. And this is where most people interrupt their own result. They don't stop completely. They just stop sustaining. They reduce effort. They hesitate. They detach. Just enough. That slight shift breaks the cycle. From their perspective, nothing worked. But in reality, the process was interrupted before completion. That's the part no one explains. The law doesn't warn you. It doesn't signal when you're close. It doesn't say stay a little longer. It stays silent, while everything builds beneath the surface. And if you don't understand that silence, you will misread it. Every time. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because now you're inside the phase. That gives nothing back. No feedback, no reassurance, no visible progress. Just continuation. And this is where it becomes dangerous. That's the invisible phase. And most people don't recognize it. Because it doesn't look like growth. It looks like delay, like pause, like nothing moved. But that perception is wrong. Because what's happening here is not above the surface. It's underneath. That's the point. What's being built underneath determines if anything will ever rise above. No depth, no structure. No structure. Collapse. So the system doesn't prioritize speed. It prioritizes stability. And stability is invisible. That's why this phase feels disconnected from results. Because the work being done is not designed to show. And it's designed to support later. And that requires time, not passive time. Active transformation. Outside your perception. Patterns are shifting. Foundations are forming. Weak points are being corrected before they ever become visible. But from your position, it feels like nothing is responding. That's the test. Not of effort, of perception. Can you continue without proof? Can you stay aligned without confirmation? That's where most people change. Not by quitting, by hesitating. They second-guess small decisions. They reduce intensity. They move with caution instead of conviction. That subtle shift weakens everything. Because this phase demands consistency at full strength, not partial engagement, not, let's see if this still works. Full continuity, even when everything suggests it isn't. That's the tension. Because nothing around you validates you here. No results, no recognition, no external reinforcement. Just you and the decision to continue. And over time, pressure builds. Quiet pressure. Through repetition. Through silence. Through lack of response. Until something inside you asks for relief. Not success. Just a sign. That's where people break. Because the system doesn't operate on reassurance. It operates on readiness. That's the rule. And readiness is built through sustained alignment, not emotional certainty. That's why this phase stretches longer than expected. Because it's not just preparing the outcome, it's preparing you to handle it, to sustain it, to not lose it when it arrives. That's the part no one sees. This phase is not where things are delayed. It's where they are decided. In everything that will appear later is being shaped here. And if you misread this moment, you won't just feel stuck. You'll walk away from the exact place where everything was about to connect. And this is where most people disappear. Not at the start. Not when it's obviously hard. Here, when nothing confirms that staying still makes sense. Because something subtle begins. It builds. You start feeling like you've been here too long. Like you've already done enough. Like now, you're just waiting without reason. That feeling creates a logic. Quiet. Convincing. Maybe it's time to adjust. Maybe this isn't the path. Maybe I need to try something else. It sounds like wisdom. It feels strategic. But it isn't clarity. It's discomfort. That's the distinction. You're not responding to new information. You're not responding to new information. You're reacting to the absence of information. And that is where people lose everything. That's where the break happens. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet. You don't quit. You pull back. Less effort, less intensity, more distraction, more distance. Slowly, you disconnect. And from your perspective, it feels like the right decision, because nothing was happening anyway. But here's what you couldn't see. You were close. That's the part no one explains. This phase, the longest one, the most silent one, is usually the one right before something shifts. Not by coincidence, by accumulation. Everything you sustained, everything you repeated, everything that was building underneath, reaches a point, a threshold, and then it connects. But thresholds don't announce themselves. They don't warn you. They don't say, just a little longer. So people leave, right before it happens. They mistake proximity for stagnation. They confuse the final stretch with a dead end. And because there are no markers, they trust feeling. That's the mistake. Because feeling, in this phase, is unreliable. This is where doubt peaks, where fatigue is highest, where change feels necessary. But that intensity is not a signal to leave. It's a signal of investment. How much has already been built? Without understanding that, it feels like a warning. So people listen. They change direction. They interrupt the cycle. They abandon something already in motion. And once they leave, the process resets. Not because the law failed, because continuity was broken. That's the truth. You don't get to see what would have happened if you stayed. You only experience what happens when you leave. And that creates a pattern. Start. Stay consistent. Wait. Feel nothing. Leave. Repeat. Until it feels like nothing works. But the system was never failing. It was being exited at the exact moment it required the most patience. And if you don't see this clearly, you will keep walking away from the very thing you've been waiting for. And this is the part almost no one sees, even after living through it. Because from the outside, it still looks like nothing. But underneath, something has been building the entire time. Quietly. Consistently. Every time you stayed when it was easier to stop, it counted. Every time you chose alignment without recognition, it counted. Every time you held direction over emotion, it counted. Not instantly, but cumulatively. That's the key. The system doesn't respond in fragments. It responds in thresholds. And thresholds don't show progress. They release it. That's the part no one explains. You expect small returns for small effort. Linear. Step by step. Visible. Predictable. But this isn't linear. It builds in silence and reveals in shifts. It's accumulation. A layer by layer. Decision by decision. Repetition after repetition. Pressure builds, unseen. And then, at a certain point, it connects. Not gradually, not in parts, all at once. But until that moment, it feels like zero. That's why people give up. Because human perception can't track invisible accumulation. You want feedback. You want signs. You want confirmation that something is adding up. But this system doesn't show progress in real time. It stores it until it becomes undeniable. So while you think nothing is happening, you're actually building something that hasn't surfaced yet. That's the inversion. And the longer you stay consistent, the more irreversible that build becomes. Because eventually, it's no longer something doubt can undo, it's already formed. But here's the deeper shift. The faithfulness was never about being seen. It was about staying aligned. That's the correction. You thought consistency needed recognition. It doesn't. It needs continuity. Because when you stay aligned long enough, you don't just create results. You become someone who can sustain them. That's the transformation. Not what you receive, but who you become without receiving, and still continuing. That version of you doesn't depend on immediate outcomes, doesn't collapse under silence, doesn't need reassurance to keep going. Because now you understand. Accumulation is happening, whether you feel it or not. And once that settles, pressure disappears. Not because results arrived, but because you no longer depend on them. That changes everything. You stop forcing timing. You stop reacting to doubt. Yet you stop adjusting based on temporary emotion. You continue from certainty, not proof. That's when the dynamic shifts. Because now, you're no longer interrupting the process. You're allowing it to complete. And when that happens, what was built in silence can't stay hidden anymore. And then, it happens. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Not with noise, not with warning. It just shifts. Quiet at first, but undeniable. Something that felt stuck moves. Something closed opens. And what felt distant suddenly becomes reachable. That's the moment. And the strange part is, it doesn't feel new. It feels familiar. Like it was always forming. You just couldn't see it yet. Because it was. That's the truth. The harvest doesn't come from one moment. It comes from everything that was sustained before it. Every time you stayed without evidence. Every time you continued without recognition. Every time you didn't leave. It all built this. And when it shows as alignment. Things connect. Opportunities appear at the right moment. People enter at the exact time they're needed. As decisions become clear, effort starts making sense. That's the shift. And suddenly, the silence you questioned reveals its purpose. Not everything, but enough. Enough to see the pattern. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was lost. It was all positioning. Every delay, every pause, every empty moment was structure. That's the reframe. What felt like absence was preparation. What felt like delay was timing. What made you question everything is what now makes everything hold. And this settles something deeper. The harvest didn't come because you forced it. It came because you stayed. That's the difference. You stayed when there was no evidence. You stayed when there was no response. You stayed when leaving made sense. And by staying, you allowed something to complete. Not just around you, inside you. Because when the result arrives, you're not the same. You're steadier, clearer, less reactive, less dependent on immediate validation. That's why you can hold it. Because now, you understand the rhythm. You don't expect instant response. You don't misread silence. You don't walk away just because you can't see movement. You recognize the phases. That's the upgrade. You trust the process because you've lived it. And once you've lived it, You can't unsee it. You move differently. You plant differently. You wait differently. You continue differently. Because now you know what feels like nothing is often everything in formation. And what once made you question your path was proof you were exactly where you needed to be.